In this chapter, we're going to discuss the basic history of psychology, where it began, and how did it end up here? How did it evolve? And second, we're going to look at the basic research methods that are employed in psychology. So first of all, we need a working definition of what psychology is. So here's a good working definition. It's the science of behavior and mental processes. An important word in that example right there is the term science. And so science actually implies that the scientific method is actually used. And so we're going to take a look at the scientific method as we progress in this discussion. So let's go back to the basic history of psychology. First of all, it is kind of known and posited that psychology actually began in early Greek philosophy. So that may surprise some individuals. They'll think, well, what does philosophy have to do with psychology? Well, one of the first major philosophers was known as Aristotle. And Aristotle was known as the first scientist. So he actually was concerned with things like, what is the nature of consciousness? Various mental processes and things like that. So he actually he presented the first treatise on psychology. Moving on here, we're going to look at this individual here named Descartes, René Descartes, and he was the individual who is famous for originating that phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And Anyway, he actually, in psychology, he is known for proposing what's known as interactive dualism. And basically all that means is he felt that the mind and the body, those are separate entities that interact and to produce their various functions, such as sensation, emotion, etc., etc. So you don't have to worry about memorizing any dates in this. I just want you to be aware of the major concepts here. The third figure we're going to talk about is Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt is considered the founder of psychology. And so he, felt that psychology should be concerned with consciousness. And so he was very influential in that regard. And he wrote some important books, in the 1800s, listed right here. And what is most important of this slide right here in this discussion is he is known for creating the first psychology lab in the 1800s. Now, after Wilhelm Wundt came Edward Titchener. And Titchener, he developed what's known as structuralism. He felt that psychologists and psychology should be concerned more with understanding the basic components of our experiences. So I'm going to just give you a very quick example. So he might have an individual come into his lab, and he might hand them something like, let's just say, an orange, a piece of fruit called an orange. And what he would do is he would say, okay, so let's think about this, let's break this down into the basic components. So he would say, what do you think about this? What do you, how does that feel? What is the color? What does that smell like? What does it taste like? So those are the various basic components of our experience of maybe dealing with an orange. So he was known for breaking down our consciousness into various components. Now, a little later came William James, and he was known as the first major American psychologist. And he developed what's called functionalism. So he felt that psychology, he was more interested in how our behaviors, how they help us adapt and survive in our environment and in life. How they help us to thrive in our environments. And so hence the word functionalism, how those help us to function better. So moving on here. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, he developed what's called psychoanalysis, and that's the most popular basically conception of what psychology is, because most people, when they think of psychology, they think of maybe an individual that's experiencing psychological discomfort, distress, maybe going to see a psychologist, going into their office, maybe laying down and then talking, about their issues. And then, an individual like Sigmund Freud, he was concerned with, well, this person is experiencing all these issues, but there's probably, an unconscious underlying reason for that might have occurred earlier in their life. And so that's how psychoanalysis was born and evolved. Now, we're going to take a quick look at behaviorism. And behaviorists, they felt that basically all we should do is worry about behavior. Because really that's the only observable, measurable type thing about to do. And so basically, Pavlov, he, for those of you who have heard about him, you might recognize his name because he was known as the salivating dog experimenter. So he basically noticed that when he was about to feed his dogs dog food, that they would begin salivating. And he began to wonder, well, what if I were to ring a bell right before they gave him dinner? And eventually, after keeping this up over a period of time, he noticed the dogs would begin to salivate as soon as they heard a bell. And eventually, he even took away the dog food and rang the bell, and they still salivated. And that became known as classic conditioning. So he was more concerned about how behavior functions in our lives. Now, we're going to jump ahead a little bit here to don't worry about the names of these two individuals so much as what this concept known as humanistic psychology. And all that refers to is the psychological ideas that each individual has unique potential for their own growth and self-direction. They're able to have self-determination, free will, and freedom of choice in their behavior. They're in charge of their lives. And that's still a very important branch of psychology even to this day, because individuals, especially in Western psychology, they like to feel that they are in charge of their own lives and they can make their own choices and set the course of direction of their lives. So that's what humanistic psychology is concerned with. Okay, now we're going to move on to contemporary psychology. So basically what's important on this slide is just to know that modern psychology, it's become very diverse and there's various perspectives. And so individuals, I'm going to move on here, they can actually focus on, specialize in one of these perspectives, or they can combine, two or more and to focus their efforts. And so basically, these are the 8 main perspectives in psychology. Just want to make you aware of these. And so basically biological, that just, refers to the physical, the biophysical perspective, like maybe dealing with the human brain and the body, that kind of thing, the biological components. Whereas the psychodynamic, that was more like Sigmund Freud, like we mentioned earlier. The behavioral perspective we mentioned earlier too, like how our behavior is influenced by our environment and that kind of thing. Humanistic we talked about. Positive psychology, that refers to, how positive thoughts and behavior can contribute to basically a better life, more positive life for individuals. Cognitive perspective, that's concerned more with mental processes, like thinking, observing, sensing, all kinds of things. So cognitive psychology is a very broad field and it's very popular to this day. Cross-cultural, that just refers to how does one's culture influence their thinking and behavior. And we'll take a look at a couple examples in a little bit. And last but not least, we'll look at evolutionary perspective. And that's just concerned with basically, how does evolution, how does that influence our thinking and behavior? So on each one of these slides that are following here, there's going to be a little more in-depth detail about each perspective. I've covered these a lot, but feel free to pause and take notes on your own. I highly recommend you do stop and just read through these. Okay, so there's all the various perspectives. You know, I don't, in the sake of time here and everything, I don't want to go over these again. You have the option to review this video at your own leisure. So there's all the various perspectives. So I am going to stop here though and talk about this here. And I did put this in here because, some of you may smile about this and everything, but I really want to, have you think about this. So how does our culture, affect our psychology and our behavior, our psychological processes and behavior? And so here's a good example. Here's a picture, of an individual, basically, pushing individuals into the subway and, cramming them in there real tight, and everything. And these individuals don't seem to mind. They're just like, hey, this is part of life. This is, we're all working together, and everything. But so I asked this questions. Well, how do you think that Americans would react to being shoved into a subway car? So that's just something to think about. Might be even interesting to discuss, in our discussion forums or something. Okay, what I want you to know here is that there are two important types of psychologists that, or the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists. And so this is a very simple difference. Clinical psychologists, they're the ones we generally think of when we think of psychology. We think of, an individual that's experiencing psychological distress or discomfort, and so we go to see a psychologist and seek help in order to feel better in life, or get past that issue. And so that is called a clinical psychologist. They're trained in the diagnosis, treatment, causes, and prevention of psychological disorders. Well, psychiatrists, on the other hand, they actually have a medical degree, and then they receive training, that clinical psychologists might get as well, but after they get their medical degree. And so here's the difference, is they're able to prescribe medications and admit patients to hospitals and things like that. But whereas a clinical psychologist cannot do that and does not do that. So just know those two differences between psychologists and psychiatrists. Okay, now we're going to begin our discussion about the scientific method. And as you remember earlier in our first slide, I mentioned that all scientists employ the scientific method. And so here's what it is, so here's a good working definition here. So it's a set of assumptions, attitudes, procedures, and they guide researchers in creating questions to investigate, and how they're going to go about getting evidence, and then eventually how are they going to draw conclusions about that evidence that that they've accumulated. So we're going to take we're going to answer those questions in a little bit here. So here are four important terms that I'd like to make you aware of. First of all, hypothesis. So when a scientist is about to do, take for instance, an experiment or a research study, they will usually form a hypothesis in the beginning. They'll say, I feel that the results that my studies are going to result in this. And so what they're doing is they're actually talking about their hypothesis. What will be the results of their research? And so a hypothesis, can, be eventually, after the study, it can be found to be basically true or untrue. And one isn't necessarily better than the other. It just really helps researchers to know how to redirect their efforts if they need to. The second term here is variable, and that's the factor that can vary or change, hence the term variable, vary. And so that can be observed, measured, and verified. And so what's important here, take for instance, a researcher is interested in the effects of coffee on sleep. Well, those are the two variables, coffee and sleep. And so we're going to go into a little more in-depth explanation just a bit. Okay, so we're going to also look at the term meta-analysis. And really all that really means is analyzing research results and the studies, results of many studies, putting them all together and then coming up with one big analysis. That is called a meta-analysis. And the final term here we're going to take a look at here is the term replicate. And all replicate means is to do it again, to repeat or duplicate something. And so definitely in science, when a study is done, if there were findings reported about it, then it is basically considered a standard operating procedure for many researchers, to do the exact same study with a lot of different people in order to see if those original findings were indeed valid. So here's the steps of the scientific method. And there's really just 4 we need to be concerned with. Step 1 is basically scientists, they formulate a specific question and that can be tested for. So take, for instance, the individual might say, I just want to know, the effects of caffeine on sleep. Well, that right there is step 1. Now, step 2 is design the study to collect the data. So they're going to, the individual might say, the researcher might say, okay, so I'm going to, give participants, this amount of caffeine each day for 30 days, and I'm going to measure the effects on their sleep from, every night. I'm going to have them keep a journal on the effects of their sleep. Well, right there, that's designing the study, how they're going to go about doing their study. Step 3, analyze the data. So at the end of their research study, then basically the scientist will analyze all the data that they accumulated through that experiment or their study. And then step 4 is report the results. So basically a researcher will publish their results in a scientific journal article. Okay, here's an important term to understand, the term theory. A lot of you have heard of, like, say, the Big Bang Theory. What is the origin of our universe? Well, a theory, what's important to understand is theory doesn't really mean fact. It really just means a tentative explanation. It's just throwing out an explanation that an individual thinks might be a good explanation of something. And what they do is they usually look at various findings and various observations, put them all together, and then form a big theory. Hence, the term Big Bang Theory, for the origin of the universe, that was put together as a result of various findings by physicists, astronomers, geologists, et cetera, and then they came up with the one big theory known as the Big Bang Theory. So there's an example. Okay, now the term pseudoscience. So what's important to understand is pseudoscience, that's basically a theory, method, or practice that kind of sounds scientific, even though it really is not. It doesn't use the scientific method. It doesn't, use empirical evidence, and everything for its claims. More often than not, pseudoscience is, can be used in advertising, to sell stuff. Or individuals who might have a personal opinion about something, and then they'll maybe give a pseudoscientific explanation for their opinion, even though it hasn't been really tested and the scientific method was not employed. So I put this question here, can you think of some examples of pseudoscience? And so maybe you might look some up, and this might be something, maybe even worth discussing, on our discussion forums. Okay, so we need to take a look at some various types of research methods. There's a couple different important ones here. And the first one is called descriptive research. All that means is descriptive research that aims to describe facts. That's really it. So basically, let's say in descriptive research, an individual scientist, might be concerned with, all they want to do is describe how individuals interact with each other in public. Do they speak to each other, or are they mostly, like, say, on their telephones or something like that? So that's descriptive research. It's not concerned with making claims or anything. It's just describing what they observed. Now, naturalistic observation. So really all that is people and animal watching. So in their natural environment. And so like I used an example, like say, let's go to another example. Let's just say a researcher is interested in wanting to see the influence of a hockey game on the violent behavior of the people in the audience. So that would be called naturalistic observation. They'll sit off and they won't, telegraph their intentions or anything. They'll just sit off to the side and just, casually observe individuals in their natural environment. Okay, so what a case study is, that all that really means is, and I'll summarize this very quickly, a case study is just concerned with a single individual. So like when one goes to a doctor and a specialist or something like that, they're usually treated as a single case. And so they'll be approached as a single individual. Now, a survey, on the other hand, that may be when one is just asked to report, like their basic thoughts, beliefs, opinions, things like that. So a lot of you have been maybe been part of surveys or participated in some. So I won't, dwell on that too much. Okay, so here's some important terms, So first, we're going to use the term sample. And so remember, here's the definition, a sample, that's a segment of a population. And so like take, for instance, an individual wants to study something in regard to all the students at Front Range Community College. Well, that's too big. That's the entire population. So they might only be able to actually include, look at maybe 100 students at Front Range Community College. Well, that 100 students right there are referred to as a sample. They represent the population, but they're only a part of the population, a sample of them. Now, another important term is representative sample. We want to make sure that our sample is representative of the population. So it kind of closely parallels the characteristics of the population. So what I mean by that is, the sample might include individuals of various ages, sexual orientation, different grade levels in school, things like that. You want the sample to actually represent the population, and not just one specific, like only the males who are 22 years old or something like that. And random selection, all that means is it's a form of selection, selecting the participants in a study, but it's done randomly. So that way, each individual in the group, has an equal chance of being included in the study. So correlation, all that means, here's an important thing. Correlation, all that refers to is basically how two factors are related to each other. So I gave the example earlier, like caffeine and sleep. Well, so we can't really say that, caffeine causes these issues with sleep, but we can say that there might be a correlation, like increased caffeine is related to decreased sleep or something like that, because, caffeine doesn't affect every human in the exact same manner. Don't worry about this term correlation coefficient. We're moving on from this. Now, one important thing to know about correlation, they can be termed positive or negative. And all that means is if they're positive correlation, that means they move in the same direction, kind of like number-wise, or, let's just say number-wise for now. So basically, take, for instance, studying technique, a certain studying technique, and GPA. So the more one uses a certain study technique, the higher their GPA gets. So those are moving in the same direction. They're going upward. Now, they can also decrease together. Like take, for instance, let's say the same exact study technique might be used, but notice that individuals, they didn't use it very much. And so that it was going downward. And then they noticed that as a result of not using it very much, their GPAs went down as well. So those are decreasing together. Now, on the other hand, negative correlation, that means they're moving in the opposite direction. So here's a good example. Increased caffeine might result in decreased sleep, amount of sleep. So that's a negative correlation. One is going up, the caffeine, the sleep is going down. Feel free to pause this and look at this if you like, to gain a little further insight, but in the spirit of time, I'm going to move on. Okay, so remember earlier we talked about descriptive research. Now we're going to go into what's known as experimental research. And what's important to understand about that is this does seek to determine a cause and effect relationship between two variables. So I'm going to give you an example here. A researcher might be interested in understanding the cause and effect relationship between a certain type of medication and its effect on depression levels in individuals. So right there's a cause and effect relationship. So this medication might result in cause a decrease in the amount of depression or strength of depression that individuals are experiencing. So they're seeking to determine the cause and effect between those two variables. Now, I use the term variables. Now, there are two types of variables, what's known as the independent and the dependent variable. So this is really simple, even though the terms themselves might be a little confusing. So I just want to tell you really quickly, the independent variable, like take for instance in the former example, the independent variable is the one that's varied purposefully. And so that would be the medication that was being used. And then the dependent variable, it depends on the amount of the medication. So that the dependent variable, that would be the depression. Remember, these are just examples. Now, a couple things, there's what's known as controls. And these are just things that are also inserted into research studies. And these are just to kind of help, kind of protect the studies here. And an important thing right here is, what's known as placebo. That is the most important one out of this, but feel free to pause the video and definitely look at all these. And the placebo, that's a fake substance treatment, that has no direct effects. So there will, maybe in a, like take for instance, the research study I referred to earlier, that was about a certain drug with depression, its effects on depression. Well, there might be a third group in there that receives a placebo. And that might even be just a simple sugar pill or something, but they think they're getting a certain drug. And so they may report some effects as well. And those effects are actually called the placebo effect. Now, we're going to wrap it up here with the last couple of things, So here's some psychological research, using brain imaging. And so these are brain scans. There are three types right here that we're just going to make you just roughly aware of. There's what's called the PET scan. You don't have to worry about memorizing these long terms like positron emission tomography, etc. But PET scan, that basically just looks at blood flow in the brain. Whereas MRI, that's concerned with looking at how the molecules are responding within the brain. But there's also what's called functional MRI or fMRI, and that usually looks at, the metabolic activity that's actually occurring in the brain or the nervous system. So that's why they call it functional MRI, because it's concerned with definitely the metabolic activity in the brain. Now, here's just, maybe an example of how a PET scan looks. And the last thing we're going to talk about here is just very quickly, we're going to talk about ethics in psychology. So it must be known that now, throughout the years, it's been very important that psychologists are guided by ethical guidelines. And those are developed by the American Psychological Association. So please pause the video, take a minute and read this right here, and take a look at this photo just to get a little more insight. And these are some examples of maybe how individuals are guided, things they have to look at. And that is it. That concludes our discussion. Good luck. Get your